All right, everyone. I have on Ara Katz today, and she's a science buff who is one of the leading microbiome experts in the country. And I'm really excited to talk with her today. She is a founder of the loved probiotic brand Seed, which I have worked with in the past, that I've partnered with, and that I also use for myself and for Jovi. And I'm really excited to talk to her because I love talking microbiome. I don't know that much about it, but it's a word that you hear tossed around a lot these days. So I'm really excited to dive into this topic with her today. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you. And just to qualify the introduction, I have the privilege of working every day with some of the leading scientists and microbiome scientists in the world. I am not a scientist, but obviously many, many years into working in the field and hopefully a good translator. But just to kind of qualify that I am not a scientist nor a doctor, so I'm not dispensing medical advice.
Got it. Perfect. And like you said, I mean, you've worked alongside them. You are obviously super passionate about it, partnering with brands and getting this information out. So for those listening, I'd love to start off with, first of all, what led you to this work? I love knowing what got you passionate about studying microbiome, about reading, diving into the research and figuring out all this for yourself and wanting to spread this message. And then what is the microbiome?
Sure. So, I had like a very strange path here. I think, a lot of women, I think, particularly once you start to have children, and if you're going to work, I come from like the startup and kind of tech world. So, if you're going to work the way that I have most of my career, I definitely got to a place where I had a miscarriage and before I had my first child. And I think it made me think really deeply about if I'm going to be working, like, what do I want to create? What kind of impact do I want to create? And I had found my way, I've been kind of in a kind of science buff, as you described it, for basically since I was in high school. My mom died when I was in high school, and that was my first experience researching clinical trials. And I think ever since then, I had this kind of like lifelong obsession with understanding, like, first of all, just understanding our bodies and understanding health and understanding science, and really trying to not let marketing dictate what we know, and making decisions from marketing, which is what I see happen a lot. And as the wellness wave, as I call it, kind of began to become this tsunami, which I think was so positive in that everybody started over-indexing in their care for their bodies and their interest in kind of like, how do I cultivate well-being? I also started to see this like real move away from science. And there was like a lot of like really beautiful and great marketing, a lot of aspirational ways of living that started to feel like less inclusive to me in a number of ways in terms of different communities, but it also felt really far away from like what we understand and what we know. Not to say that science knows everything, but to say that like I found it to start to tell narratives about our bodies and our health and the way things work that I don't know I bought into. And I come out of building consumer brands and consumer tech, and out of interesting kind of background of like this weird intersection of kind of design and media and technology. And I really had felt that when I finally got pregnant, I really went through the world like thinking about, well, what do I want to create? But also when you're pregnant, the world is giving you so much advice and information, whether it's the Amazon algorithm or the unsolicited advice of someone at a dinner party. Like you get all this information. And I started to like really re-spark for me that question of like, where does this information even come from? Like so much of it from my even basic understandings of biology, anatomy, health, was like so ungrounded in a truth that I felt resonated. And around that same time, and for even maybe before that, the microbiome certainly had been on my radar based on some early scientific studies. Certainly some, as like gluten intolerances and other intolerances were really starting to rise, I started noticing and reading and starting to connect some dots, and certainly started to see from a just consumer perspective this like new awareness as the microbiome is this kind of like axis of health that for so many people struggling with particularly autoimmune conditions and really complex chronic conditions for which there really are no like immediate cures or solutions, it became this like almost like this messiah, like this place where like we felt like there were going to be all these solutions, and the gut started to become this kind of area that you could start to see so many parts of our health and interests, and different people with different conditions, communities, like thinking about like what is the gut's role in what I'm experiencing. And I started to see, from all different, and then you could see like South Park had a microbiome episode. You started to just see like in the zeitgeist these kind of like constellation forming, and at the same time the probiotics industry was just like just going up and to the right. But I really saw that that was really where there was no science, very little science being done. In a field that, like, when you really speak to scientists, the application of like, how are we going to take microbes and improve human health based on the velocity of what we were learning about the microbiome made a lot of sense. It's just that the marketing, what we like to say at Seed, was that the evangelism was just way ahead of the evidence. And so I should probably then, and really that's where I then had my child. After about a few months, I had a lot of trouble breastfeeding, like maintaining my supply. And yet I was already then, by that point, working and starting to think about microbiome. And that was when I was just like, I went out looking for a formula that really understood the importance of the microbiome, which meant that like it was sufficient with the appropriate probiotics, the appropriate prebiotics, what they call HMOs in breast milk. And there was nothing that, it was like, everyone just said, get the European stuff, but it's so expensive, get this, put this. But like, there really wasn't a good answer for something that really needed to exist in this critical window, which I'm sure we'll talk about on this episode, where like your child's microbiome is developing and really setting like a blueprint for, for health for life. And that was really when and then I had met my co-founder during that time, who was of course on the science side. And we said there was a huge opportunity to create this bridge between the humans and the needs that were evolving around probiotics and microbiome-based solutions, and the science that was really coming out of some of the most exciting academic places around the world with the best scientists, but that there was a disconnect in the way that people were purchasing and participating as consumers and humans trying to cultivate a healthy microbiome. And what was happening in science. And I think that's where we saw this opportunity to create that bridge.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I like that you said just kind of getting caught up in the marketing, because I'm a huge victim of that. Like, I'll see a good ad and I'm like, oh my gosh, I need this product. I need this vitamin. They're like, oh, every woman should be on this supplement. Every person should be taking this thing. And I'm like, oh, I'm going to buy it. And I've learned, like, over the last couple of years, slowly, not as quickly as I should, that I shouldn't just be blindly taking whatever supplements some random person's recommending. Because first of all, I don't know what my body necessarily needs. And if these supplements are great, if they're third party tested, if they're regulated, like if anything, also what authority does this person have, just saying this. So I'm a huge victim to those ads. To my cupboard is full and I need to go through and throw things out that have just been there for years. And then the learning along the way of like, if you're getting sick, you should take this thing, and then learning that might be harsh for your gut. Like this might, and I'm like, okay, so should I be taking oregano if I feel like I'm getting sick, or should I not? That's like one of those things that you hear could be harsh for your gut or whatever. So there's so much out there, and it can be really hard knowing where to go, where to learn, and what information we could use. So that was one of the things that I loved partnering with Seed when I did before, because in order to like partner with them, they make you watch a series of videos so that you understand about the gut a little bit more, and how a lot of probiotics don't even make it to where they need to go. And I was like, I had no idea that information before, which I think it was like a couple years ago. So I'd love to dive into it a little bit. Let's start maybe at birth. And
and we also should probably define the microbiome, if that's cool, because we didn't
yes.
Yeah. I can start with that if that's okay, just because I think it's so. One of the things we try and do at Seed is like really make sure we know what we mean by so many of these words, because to your point about marketing, like these words get thrown around in marketing and in other places where like you're then all working from different understandings. So I'll try and give like we always work in like nerdier, nerdiest. So I'll start with the nerd definition, and if you want to go any deeper, you just let me know. So the nerd definition of microbiome is that it is the collection of microbes that exist in the human body, in, on, and around the human body. That means, and there are different biomes of the body. And the reason that when people say microbiome, most people are referring to gut health is because the gut is the largest and most diverse microbial ecosystem of the body. Thousands of species of bacteria. The second biggest is our oral microbiome. That's about 700 plus species of microbes that exist in our oral microbiome. And then you have other biomes of the body. So you have the skin microbiome, you have the nasal microbiome, you have the optical microbiome, you have a scalp microbiome, you have an armpit microbiome. For women, you have a vaginal microbiome. There's a general, just a genital microbiome. And even within the skin microbiome, for example, even like the skin, for example, in areas where like you have more sebaceous glands, that microbial ecology, like on your back, for example, on your face, is different than like your elbow. So and so when you say microbiome, technically, it is all of the microbes that exist in and on around the body. But very specifically, usually we're talking about the gut, and that is because of just like where the science started, where the field started, but also because it is the most complex and diverse and largest microbiome of the body.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Another one that I recently learned about is a nipple microbiome.
Yes.
And I didn't know that.
And they're like, and not just that, the breast milk microbiome. So breast milk has its own microbial ecology, which is also fascinating, and I'm sure we'll get into as we talk about seeding and birth. But the nipple microbiome is a fascinating one because many of the microbes that evolved that live on the nipple are incredible at helping with the digestion of lactose. So if you can just imagine like how extraordinary evolution is, that this co-evolutionary dance that we have done with as humans and these friends that live in and on us, and the role that they play in developing like the health of our children, which is extraordinary in their own microbiome. And so if you could just imagine that like microbes evolved to live on our nipples that have like do very specific things that interchange with the saliva in your baby's mouth, and then play a role in like how they digest like a sugar in breast milk like lactose. Like it's really extraordinary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's wild. I remember reading probably like in the last year how after you have the baby, you really shouldn't be using soaps on your nipples, which I don't anymore at all. Like I'll wash maybe like my chest, but then just kind of let the water run over my breasts because I don't want to disrupt that microbiome. But yeah, our bodies are amazing. And like one thing that I'm continually trying to remind myself of, because we'll get into it. Like and people who listen to this podcast know that I've had gut issues for years. But one thing that I try to remind myself of, because I can go down that rabbit hole, is that our bodies are working for us for the most part and not against us. Like they're trying to detox, they're trying to like whatever. And yes, we need to support them in doing this, but I can like go down this path of like, I'm not doing every single thing right. I'm not, and it's like, okay, but I'm doing my best. And I live in Chicago. It's 20 degrees out today. So this time of year, what we do looks different than in the summer. Like getting fresh air isn't, with my 9-month-old, it's a little tougher, like things like that. So I know those things are important, but I have to not let myself feel guilty, because most of the accounts I follow on Instagram are like from California. They're like, walk barefoot immediately in the morning and go outside and play. And I'm like, it's 20 degrees here.
But there's also, there's a nice way to find like a through line, right? Like, I think very few people would argue from a circadian rhythm perspective, of which, by the way, your microbes have their own. 15 to 20 minutes of like daylight first thing in the morning is really, really important. Really important. Like that's from a clock internal biological clock perspective. That can happen if necessary next to a window. ideally outside. But there's also like interesting research, there's interesting research about like the importance of cold
Mm-hmm.
on cellular health, the importance of like children being outside. Like there is an amazing study of the preschools, I think, believe it was in Scandinavia or Sweden, where they have the children nap outside
Mm-hmm.
in there, and so it's really, I think, the exposure to the outside. Yes, you can't, you don't have to do it idyllically in bare feet. But I think you can take the things that are like where there's evidence, and you can say, okay, like if I was to hear that from a scientific perspective, I would take a couple things out of that. One would be exposure to light, natural light, like sunlight and daylight, at a specific time in the morning. And I would take, to your point about like seasonality, exposure to nature or being outside, and exposure to temperature change. Which, if you think about from an immune perspective, like, and one of the things I loved about what you said is like, you shouldn't feel guilty. I think one of the worst things that has happened in wellness, that we always talk about a lot, is that, health has almost been defined as like this beautiful, perfect end state that you'll one day reach if you do all of these things, which is like, by the way, a never ending, expanding list of things. And if you think about like beauty standards and what Photoshop did to women's understanding of themselves, I think of all these wellness things a little bit like Photoshop, in the sense that they create an illusion that there's this end point that one day if you do things you will reach, and then therefore you will be healthy. And the way we define health at Seed, and from a microbiome perspective, is that health is a verb. It is actually like a daily, it is something you do, and that you do, like you do health. And what you're working towards is not like some perfect end state where you would look at like your blood panel and it would be perfect. But to your point about seasons changing, our environment and our inputs change all the time as humans. And what we care about, and when you say what they're trying, you have to think about your body is always trying to help you. We think about it as your body's always trying to get back to stasis. And so if you think about health, much like you would think about mental health, actually, as the cultivation of resilience, that is what like an ecosystem in stasis or in balance wants to be. You can't say, it is irrational to think in our world that you will not be exposed to or expose yourself to, unknowingly or knowingly, things that are going to throw you off.
Mm-hmm.
You go on an airplane, whether you eat bad food, you experience food poisoning, whatever that is, like you don't go outside, God forbid, for 5 days in daylight for the 20 minutes when you wake up. There's no question, or temperature changes for seasonality. There's no question that our experience and our environment fluctuates. So the question is, how quickly can we get back to stasis, and how resilient are we? Not, are we somehow on our way to this like nirvana of health that on Instagram is going to look a very specific way. And I
Right.
think that that is like one of the most critical things, and particularly like when you play the mental health game and you start to about like what you should, Harvey Karp, the pediatrician Harvey Karp says, don't should on yourself.
Yeah.
And I always really liked that. He told me that when I had my first baby, and I really have always liked that, because I think that that stress alone, if you understand the impact of stress on our bodies and on our microbiome, unto itself is unhealthy, and can be. And by the way, when you talk about gut-brain connection, you start to understand the impact of stress then on like digestion and GI health. You start to realize that you're just kind of participating in like a very unvirtuous cycle, that really doesn't serve us. But we love thinking about doing health, because it makes it feel like at any moment you can make a change and an adjustment that you're and have agency in it, versus this like destination that you'll reach one day, that I think is unattainable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really good and important to remember. Because again, it's so easy to get sucked
Yes.
in that. And like you said, I mean, so much more is coming out, and it's like, oh, now I got to do this, now I got to do that. And it can feel overwhelming sometimes,
Yes.
depending on your season of life too. Like I have two and under, and I'm like, like,
Yes.
they're like, you need to be sleeping this amount. And I'm like, I'm trying, but some of
Yes.
that's out of my control right now. So
Yes.
it can definitely be hard, but I'd love to talk about building resilience in our kids, and how like setting up the gut microbiome at a young age, like what that does or what we can do. Because there are so many things out of our control. I know with my first, I tried to do everything right. I tried, at least what I thought I knew was right. Um, and being a doula, like there's a lot of physiological birth stuff I understand and know. Trying to build up my gut for my child, and then it was a really long traumatic birth, and she ended up in the NICU for a week, being on two different antibiotics, and it was really hard for me not to beat myself up, to be like, now her gut health is ruined, like what am I going to do? Like
Yes.
I was really hard on myself just because of some of the information I know. And obviously I know her health's not completely destroyed,
Yeah.
but I knew that that would have some long-term implications on her. So
Yeah.
I'd love to kind of dive into that.
Yes, I mean, it's look, it is interesting. Like this, there's the kind of C-section versus vaginal birth discussion, and then there's the what is correlated with some of those things that and what accompanies like often C-sections or like complicated births, and that is often antibiotics, and then very often, if particularly with a NICU stay, accompanies not breast milk, right? So either formula or a mother then doesn't have the chance to really get that early latching, and so there's there's implications to it. It's not just the C-section or the complex birth or vaginal like as binaries. I think there's a lot of things, and then of course there's extended exposure to hospital stay, which has its own sterility and exposure to other of the environmental things like the cleaners that are used, the like what that how that impacts the skin micro. There's it's like there is a little bit of a cascading factors that wouldn't be if you said to a scientist, what are the ways that you cultivate like a healthy microbiome from like day zero. However, in what I was saying, in the spirit of, and I think you said this really beautifully before we started, in the not look back, but like, what do I do and take this forward? There are so many things depending on like kind of almost like a decision tree. Breastfeeding is probably one of the biggest, because we know that beyond just vaginal, even with vaginal births, there are some studies that say that breastfeeding accounts for almost 30% of the seeding of a child's microbiome. So then you say, okay, but I couldn't breastfeed past a month. So like then that puts you into another decision, right? And I think there's and kind of down a different path. And beyond breastfeeding, beyond the presence of antibiotics and beyond mode of birth, there are a number of things that after a child is born and at different stages, right? Because once before pre-solid foods and then solid foods, but for the most part, environment is such a big one. Whether or not you have a dog or a pet, for example, dogs are incredible microbial diversifiers for anyone that's living in the house, not just children, but it's an interesting, obviously, like training, immune system training wheels to be exposed to microbes that are coming in from the outside that dogs are bringing in. Same thing with being in nature. Children and humans are exposed to microbial diversity that they're not going to see in their homes. Our homes and the built environment in general is far more sterile. So time in nature, exposure to soil and dirt and like real proximity, I think to some of these microbes can have a really important impact. Hygiene. So obviously brushing teeth early on is not as important because there are often no teeth or just two little ones on the bottom. But hygiene just in general, like I'm of the opinion that like, and we have some data coming out on this that's really interesting, and certainly other scientists and groups have done this, but really there's no need to be using surfactants on a child for the most part. For me, it's really only when there's sunscreen that you want to remove, but for the most part, there really isn't much reason outside of like water and maybe like a tiny bit of diluted, like something really mild, that should be used for any kind of cleaning. Other than that, just some water. So like really allowing, in some ways, it's almost like what you don't do more so than what you do.
Yeah.
And of
That
course,
makes me feel good because I remember when my oldest was little, our routine was to take a bath every night, but I would go like forever and I'd be like, it's been like 2 weeks since I like washed her hair or used like
yeah,
any form of soap on her. I'm like, is she
yeah.
okay?
I mean, I'm 7 months into my child now, and I don't think he's ever used soap.
Wow, that's awesome.
You know, and as I said, I think once when I had sunscreen on his body, and that was.
Yeah. Is that true for adults too?
So I'd say that I would say that if you, I don't know if you've read James Hamlin's book Clean,
Mm-mm.
but I really like the way he describes it. I think he wrote a book a little bit about, and I'm sure you may have heard of like the hygiene hypothesis, which is essentially we've kind of over cleaned ourselves into many of these chronic conditions. We work under a little bit of a different hypothesis, which I can get into, which is out of Switzerland, the work of Dr. Actis, which speaks about the epithelial barrier hypothesis. But I essentially I do think that we completely overclean ourselves. I don't think I mean, malassezia and some of this, for example, just scalp alone, we're starting to see like crazy spikes in this in the scalp microbiome being what we call dysbiotic or out of balance. Certainly, when you look at the face, I think we absolutely over clean and overuse many compounds that have not been tested to really deeply understand their impact on the skin barrier, and what dosages for toxicity, because that's actually not how FDA and others kind of currently today call for testing to
Right.
determine safety. And for our bodies, I think for the most part, like my usual advice is put a very mild soap in areas where you have sebaceous glands and where you sweat. So like genitals, underarm, maybe a little feet, and clean your hair from time to time, maybe once a week.
Hmm.
And
Oh, I'm good then.
if you need it.
Yeah.
But for the most part, like these things become, as I kind of said, unvirtuous cycles, which is that you just continue to disrupt the barrier, and the microbiome, and then you continue to have different, this kind of, it just kind of exacerbates whatever issue you have over time. But also, like, we just don't need, I mean, it is just, I mean, and again, I'm speaking so generally, like if you go in a pool and you have chlorine on your body, chlorine changes your skin microbiome. That's where I might use a little bit more soap, for example.
Hmm.
When you go in the ocean changes your microbiome actually. So like, there's certain things, not for long and sustained periods of time, but all of these things. I think what I'm generally saying is what I would love parents to walk away with understanding, both for themselves and their children, is that, it, like, in the same way that you think about climate change and you think about ecologies that we want to preserve, I think the same way about the ecologies of our body, right? And I think in a lot of cases, the answer is leave it alone, or do the least amount of intentional self-care and hygiene, in a way that is not as least disrupting as possible. And of course, that's very easy for me to say, like when you learn science all day, and it's easy to make decisions, and you're up against all the marketing of people saying this is natural, this is better for you. So I understood that, like, as a general consumer, these are really challenging questions. And this is truly why you asked me before, like why I started Seed, is we're working on a lot of these things that will come out in the next couple of years, specifically because it is very hard to find what is actually the answer.
Hmm.
Because the stuff that even says it is natural and clean and good sometimes isn't.
Right.
Um, and I think that we're in a moment where our continued exposure to all of these substances is making us really sick.
Hmm.
And it's really like, and so I think this is a much bigger problem in some ways than I think people feel like, oh, we had the clean movement and now we're good because all the products now don't have the bad stuff in it. And I think what we're seeing in our science is that that's not true.
Right.
There's another revolution to be had that maybe has a bit more science to it, and looks at many of these substances and these choices that we make through the lens, a much finer resolution lens that can look at the microbiome and our barriers, and be able to really understand and redefine kind of what toxic actually means, because I think it's a bit loose right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense.
Hmm.
Um, before I got you off on that
Oh,
tangent, I know that we were talking a little bit more about kids and just like what we can do, because there are things out of our control at birth. There's also lack of education and support
yes.
in that area. as well. So you might not know all your options, may not have had somebody to advocate for you. Finding really good supportive providers can be a challenge. But now we have this baby, right? And there's things that we can do or
Mhm.
things that we don't need to do. So when it comes to like foods, we start introducing foods to
Yeah.
them.
Mhm.
Where are there certain foods that you absolutely recommend for helping build their microbiome? And then I'd love to talk about how that gut microbiome in kids helps set up immunity for life.
Sure. So I would say there's a few things. First of all, there's a lot of kind of cultural and religious and other components that go into like first foods, right? Like in Ayurvedic culture, like in Ayurvedic practices, there's the introduction of grains first. So just to say that like my lens is coming much more from like a more pure scientific perspective, but that like obviously there's a lot of different, from a cultural perspective, I think a lot of cultures around the world really get it right, and actually very naturally align with microbiome science because they're they're not as precious and like pureeing a bunch of like high sugar fruits and just like shoving it in a kid's mouth with no texture and letting them like, which is I find to be the equivalent of like soda later on. And so I think that the way that I've thought about it is, one of the things that we, first of all, babies and timing and every child's a little bit different. Some children are, have reflux issues. Some children are more prone to gas at certain stages. So just take what I'm saying, like, of course, very, very generally. And then I think there's certain adjustments that you have to make when you know your baby. And particularly if they're gaseous or they experience some discomfort with certain foods, like very cruciferous vegetables, for example. Sometimes you have to wait a second, and you need to start with some of the starchier ones that just because they get on discomfort, and then it's not like you're hurting them. But if you want to sleep and you wanted them to not be uncomfortable, you can kind of ease into it. I come from like the perspective of diverse amount of plants and fibers. I am really enjoying like learning and like experimenting right now with what is a newer area of a way of feeding babies, which is called we may have talked about it on the podcast already, but baby-led feeding, which I'm finding to be fascinating. And there's a lot of really interesting early work because it hasn't been longitudinal enough, but and that is really that like when they're in the palmar grasp, starting with foods that they can hold like with their hand, like so big pieces, so like literally like a 6-month-old holding like a big green bean, for example, and like, which is scary because when the big piece comes out in their mouth, it does elicit sometimes that gag reflex. But I like the way that it's training a child. I think it really relies on, and then when they have the pincer grasp, it's kind of cubed food, but it really allows a child to begin to, and the reason that I connect this a little bit in microbiome, which is more of a hypothesis, but something that I'm fascinated by, is our gut-brain connection is what signals satiety. And when you're just shoving food into a child's mouth consistently with a spoon that's pureed and doesn't have texture, and that they have no agency in controlling it in any way, I think that it has some early miss signals around like being satiated and starting to understand, in the same way that children start to understand that they can self-soothe and fall back to sleep. I think there are some early cues around food and eating that I think the baby-led is really interesting for, as it relates to gut brain and the signaling of like when you are satiated and how your body can become good at that earlier rather than later, which I think is just kind of an interesting one. So that's kind of like mode of feeding. And there's a couple of great books that are written on them. They're really simple to find on Amazon, and they're just very basics, but very easy to follow and do. In terms of the actual food, I really rely on like a variety of diverse plants. So like everything from like, I try and kind of look at it a bit from a rainbow perspective just to make it easy. If it's greens and you want to stay away from like, kale and Brussels sprouts and broccoli early, just because those can cause more gas. I really like zucchini and green beans to start, and also have added in little piece of red pepper. And also the nice thing about the baby-led feeding is the things that would be really gaseous for them, they're not going to eat a lot of when they're just holding it, but they can get the taste of it. I veer away from fruits that are really sugary early. You'll see that they'll just they're getting so much of sugar from breast milk at this stage, or from if they're taking formula, that I have found that to me, I introduce that much later, and with a really good dense fibrous meal, just so that it's not the thing that's kind of filling them up. Oatmeal and grains, so mixing of millet and flax and oatmeal, I find to be and add in some wild blueberries, things that and again fruits that tend to have a little bit less of a sugar content. Pomegranate, really diverse berries that are really dark are very dense in polyphenols, which are very, very good for the benefit, a food substrate for good bacteria in the baby's developing gut. And so I think it's looking at kind of grains, and then beans. I just, again, same thing, because they can be gaseous. I focus a lot on mung beans and a little bit of rice, which both create a complete protein. But also I find that mung beans and lentils are just a little easier on their when they're really starting, than some of the bigger and maybe heavier beans, like kidney beans, for example, a little bit later. But again, you can just mix in a tiny bit too. And I think about it also from a food tolerance perspective. So now getting to the next part of your question, which is, how do I introduce food? And how is that related to the development of a microbiome as it relates to immune health? So we could probably just start by unpacking that a little bit from a food allergy perspective first, because food allergies are growing. They did not exist really before 1950 in this country. The amount of the incidence of food allergy, not just in children, but just because children are, some of the greatest risk, and we're seeing it in such higher incidences today than we've ever seen it before, and only growing. And there's a lot of theories around that. We know that the microbiome plays a very critical role in the signaling of whether or not a food should trigger or not trigger an immune response. And a lot of thinking says early exposure and early measured exposure to what could be considered an allergen can train the immune system, almost like training wheels, to gradually understand that it is not a real trigger, a real threat to the immune system, or to the host, which is you or the child. So I do it very carefully. I think introducing one food at a time is really important, but at least taking what we know today from microbiome science and from where immunology is, I believe that introducing it as early as possible in small amounts to really just make sure there is no obviously anaphylactic reaction or whatever is very, very important. So whether it's egg, nuts, trying all different kinds, and just monitoring. I never try something that could be a potential, cause a potential allergy in the last feed. You always do it as early in the day as possible, so you can monitor a child all day, just to make sure that if you gave them a little bit of let's say you took zucchini and rolled it in a little almond flour and maybe baked it or whatever, just to make sure that there's not a reaction while they're sleeping, or while they can't be as closely monitored. So there's little things like that I think are really important. There are some companies that have popped out from some scientists, particularly Carrie Nadeau out of UCSF, who's one of our scientific board members, has a company, I believe it's called Spoonful One, that you can kind of get little amounts of these that you can add to baby food, but you can also just use the food itself. To be able to introduce them, and then kind of monitor and just make sure there's no kind of allergic reaction. So that's kind of I believe the training wheels model of kind of early food introduction, that at least where we are today feels one of the most meaningful ways, both to identify and diagnose one early, but also to train over time to say, hey, this actually is not bad and shouldn't trigger an immune response. And there's been, and obviously for kids that even have full-blown developed allergies later, OIT, which is the oral, the exposure therapy, is people do see good results with that, even in children that are older that have developed a full-blown food allergy.
Hmm. Yeah, that's so interesting. Um, I remember being told that you want to start exposing them to things early. I was even told breastfeeding too, like when
Yeah.
you're breastfeeding to eat, like have some dairy, have some wheat, have these different things so that they're getting exposed
Yes.
to it through the breast milk and then introducing it into the solids, even if it's not something like you have all the time, just to get that
Right.
exposure.
I think that that holds up for a number of the other things we were talking about, whether it's exposure to nature, diverse environments, pets, animals. Like I think anywhere where if you just think about it as like a training ground, like you have training wheels on your immune system when you're really early, the exposure helps you continue to kind of create your immune system to create pattern recognition, such that your body does not erroneously mount an immune response. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that's a good way of thinking about it, even beyond food.
Mm-hmm. I've heard, and I can't think of the exact number right now, but I've heard before that like your kid's immune health or gut health is set by this specific age. Is that true?
You know, it's an interesting question because it makes it feel so binary. And then to your point about like I think what we were talking about before we started recording, like it makes it then feel almost like this like hopeless um act, like if your child ends up with an autoimmune condition early on, like and you just kind of feel like, oh, we're like screwed for life. Yes, I think the blueprint for a child's microbiome is before that, like 5 years, where it reaches what they call a steady state microbiome, which is kind of like establishing like your microbial kind of like signature in the early windows. Yes, they are very critical windows. Yes, that imbalance and disruptions during those windows are incredibly highly correlated with the development of a number of conditions, whether it's food allergies, whether it's autoimmune conditions, etc., later in life, undoubtedly. So like I don't want to underplay the importance, but I think that would probably agree that like a child, let's say, who had multiple courses of antibiotics before 5 years of life, um, ended up as a C-section child and maybe wasn't breastfed, but is eating and being nurtured in a way with like a healthy diet. He has parents that are now like, or she has parents that are now a bit more mindful of like discretionary use of antibiotics moving forward, are doing things like being mindful of like when to use specific medicines that can also disrupt your microbiome, going outside and playing, maybe has a pet, has good exposure to foods that could potentially be triggering. There are things that I think even in the presence of some of the factors that would be what we would call like higher risk earlier in life, I believe that that doesn't mean that you should just kind of give up and be like, well, just eat whatever you want because you're screwed because we screwed up these 5 things and like really had no choice about these 4 factors that we know are important. So I think a lot of it is, and it's kind of going back to what I was saying about health as a verb, right? Like you may not be able to change some of the blueprint you were given, but you can certainly like choose the materials you build the house with, right? Like you really have a lot of opportunity, like every single day, by the way, like to change. And the microbiome is fascinating because it changes really. While you do have this kind of like core microbial signature and this kind of your steady state microbiome, there are many things that can shift your microbiome, particularly diet and nutrition being the probably biggest lever we have, that tremendously impact the outcome of how your gut, your immune system is functioning. And that's, a lot of the things that nothing that you probably haven't heard before, but that's everything from like moving and exercise, to diet, to, as I said, hygiene. our exposure to toxins, chemicals, whether or not you smoke, whether or not, I mean, there's so many things, whether or not you incorporate, obviously a probiotic and prebiotics, whether you have a pet, whether you're traveling a lot, or how your sleep is, so many of the lifestyle factors that we're already considering, and I think we all generally kind of have a good sense of what's quote unquote healthier in terms of habits and choices, absolutely still continue to play a role in how those things manifest and how they can be managed. Um, uh, but as I said, I wouldn't want to underplay it, but I think that should not then feel like this aspect of like hopelessness. Because I think there's so many choices we make on a daily basis, both consciously and sometimes unconsciously, that make a huge impact.
Yeah. Well, a lot of what you're saying too, I mean, obviously applies to us as adults. Because sometimes it can be hard because for me, like, I know my journey, I've had gut issues, whatever, for a long time. In high school, I just thought I had like IBS, right? I'm like, I just have IBS. I, just fart all the time and like randomly get diarrhea. So that's just my life. And like years later, basically, yeah, I mean, it was like 3 years ago, I ended up finding out I had a parasite and I had like all this other stuff, things wrong with my liver, with my hormones, and it was all connected. So it wasn't, he was saying, the guy that I was working with, he's like, this wasn't like a gut issue. He's like, your liver's not working properly. So it's taxing on your gut. And it's, then everything else isn't able to work properly. And then I did have a parasite, and it can be like so hard finding the right person to go to talk about these things. Because now I'm back in that place where my husband and I want to start trying to conceive again next year, but we're working on our health right now. And I know some things are off with both of us. And the providers that we want to go to, insurance doesn't cover. And it can be really expensive to find people who are willing to do certain testing to find out some of these things. But what are maybe just some things, obviously, getting outside, getting variety in our diets, things like that. What are some things as adults that we can do for ourselves now that we're out of our parents' care, right? And to help set ourselves up to help improve our gut health.
I mean, it's not that dissimilar to what I have already said, and you're right. It really is I mean, outside of course breastfeeding. Although I say that, but there's many people working on products and development of things that use the HMOs from breast milk actually for adults. So I say not breast milk, but maybe some of the constituents of breast milk may actually prove to be things that really are very impactful for adults at later ages. But beyond some of the stuff that's coming, I mean, look, diet is, in my opinion, when it comes, if you want to talk about gut health, diet is 98% of it. I think that, of course, like, and look, the interesting thing about the gut, I was talking to one of our scientists earlier today, because for example, you brought up the liver. The gut-liver axis is really interesting. The gut-liver axis plays a role in cholesterol reuptake into the body, and that, as you said, it was all connected. Is that the gut, it has these different axes out to different aspects of our systemic health. There's the gut-skin axis, there's the gut-brain axis, there's the gut-liver axis, there's the gut-lung axis, and they're not like unidirectional, they're bidirectional. And so a lot of the things that we do have an impact in these different, in systems, in ways that, like, by the way, science hasn't even elucidated all of them today. But the more that we understand, the more we understand that these things are really like cyclical, circular, and really deeply all connected. And so the reason I was saying that is that, and what made me think of that as I brought up exercise is, exercise is important for your gut, but your gut also can be a part of how you exercise and how well you can exercise. The oral microbiome, by the way, there's a lot of athletes that will not use mouthwash because we know that like disruption of the oral microbiome has an impact on like muscle recovery. So it's like you start to see the microbiome is fascinated because you really start to understand that how these ecologies of your body are connected to so many different things. But I would say overall, like, exercise and movement is incredibly important. Sleep from a microbiome perspective is very important. I was mentioning earlier that you have, there's a biological circadian rhythm, but microbes also have a circadian rhythm. Stress is incredibly the microbiome very much responds to stress. I think anyone who's just had disrupted GI issues and has felt it exacerbated during periods of stress, immediately, of course, understands the gut-brain connection. But, microbes even respond to, there was a study many years ago in a crowded elevator that they saw a microbial shift in somebody just by being in like a crowded, like stressful experience and environment, which is fascinating. The avoidance of of antibiotics and very specific medications like antacids and even NSAIDs like Advil and ibuprofen. I think people take these things. We're in a culture where you have some pain and you just take something, oregano oil included, right? Oregano oil is a incredibly strong antimicrobial and antibiotic. So I think we often take some of these things a bit indiscriminately. And so I think just being mindful, like, look, antibiotic will save your life under the right circumstances, but unfortunately there's 251 million prescriptions written for antibiotics every year in the United States, over half of which are for things that are not bacterial.
Right.
So that's 125 million prescriptions of antibiotics that are actually unnecessary, which cause dysbiosis and imbalance in the gut. And then of course all these downstream effects from that. And of course that happens and is compounded over time with other things that of course then lead to some of the conditions that we see rising so quickly in our country and also in others. And then, a lot of the things we talked about earlier, which is, just being outside, like exposure to nature, exposure to diverse microbial ecosystems that you find in soil and nature, et cetera. Pets, as I said, and exposure to different microbes there. But really, I think one of the most impactful ones is diet, for sure. I think hygiene, and hygiene, I think, is probably one of the other really meaningful ones, because it is by disrupting these barriers of our body, like whether it's the gut, whether it's our respiratory tract, or it's our skin. For women, it's also the vaginal barrier, mucosa, and which can be disrupted by surfactants that women use for cleansing, like from a vaginal perspective, which also can be highly disrupting. And one of the ways that happens is that we disrupt these barriers of the skin when we like over clean, or we use compounds that can be what we call kind of create permeability in those barriers. And when you create permeability in those barriers, microbes that are living above them, or and as part of like that, the microbiome of that particular area, if it's in your gut or your vagina or your skin, then once there's openings in the barrier, microbes move in, and of course there's something now, and other substances, by the way, and of course your immune system is like, whoa, the gate's been breached, like I need to mount an immune response. And so we just sit in these states of what Dr. Akis, I was mentioning, calls like microinflammation. And so I think hygiene is another one that I think will probably start to undergo its own revolution in terms of how we think about cleaning our bodies, our children's bodies, how we think about the surfactants of our mouth, for example, for the oral microbiome, how we clean our mouths, how important the mouth is. We're starting to understand the oral microbiome's role in neurodegenerative disease. We're starting to understand the role of the oral microbiome and its role in like cardiovascular health, respiratory health. So there's a lot of those are probably the big groups, which is like the food and movement, and then like the things to avoid, really, and of course just like a general mindset that just allows you to say, like, how can I consider this like really important part of my health when I'm making a lot of these different choices. And I think that's, when you ask me like what our brand is, and why we spend so much time communicating science and educating it, beyond our products, which of course we're very proud of, but really beyond that, I think that if people can start to cultivate that mindset of just thinking about their microbiome the way that you think about other parts of your health, I think you'll just naturally start to make, choices that kind of consider this ecosystem that's, to your point, like just wanting to help us be healthy.
Yeah. I love that you were talking about the oral microbiome. I talked with somebody a while ago on here, but I know that it's something I haven't like heard that much in the mainstream starting more recently, but and I can't think of his name right now. It was like 2012 before like podcasts were a thing. I used to go on this guy's website and listen to his
Uh-huh.
podcast, and he had an oral microbiome summit. And I learned
Amazing.
so much about
Oh, cool.
the gut and mouth
Yeah.
relationship. I haven't
Wonderful.
like mouthwashed in years. Um, but like, I mean, I guess if I randomly like needed to or something, but like, just even the products I was choosing to use on my teeth and how that could be impacting my gut, mouth breathing, things like this that really impact that stuff. Um, and it's super interesting. That was like my first like exposure to it. And then I started hearing more and more, and I'm like, wow, this is so fascinating that like even the time all the millions of like nerve endings that are going to each tooth that are telling signals and sending things like it's wild. um and the dental world, the conventional dental world has not
Yes.
caught up to any of this. So I even
I
remember, I
know.
think it was like, man, how many years ago? 6, 7 years ago, I had all my mercury fillings removed, things like that, because I had some
Yep.
from childhood. And I'm like, oh, I'm getting this out, like all these different things.
Yep.
Um, but it was super, super fascinating. And I'm like, man, everything really is connected. And this last week, my 2-year-old's been crawling in our bed. And the it's just kind of been stuffy here lately. So we have the humidifier going, we have our air purifiers going,
Yep.
but she was snoring the last couple of nights. And I'm like, I don't think she normally snores, but if this is like, I kind of want her to keep crawling in so I can see if this is like a normal thing. Cause I'm like, that's something that we got to check out if she's sleeping with her mouth open, if she's snoring,
Yep.
because this could disrupt her gut, like all this
Yes.
stuff. It's cool learning this information and learning like, oh, I can like look out for these things now and, maybe go see somebody, see what we can do.
Absolutely.
And yeah, it's super fascinating. Um, and I know that I've been falling asleep with my mouth open because I've been so tired. And so I'll go in and nurse my 9-month-old and I'll fall asleep in the chair and I'm
Oh,
like,
yeah.
just with
Yep.
my head back and my mouth open. And I wake up
Totally.
and I'm so dried out. And I'm like, oh,
Good.
just if I sleep in my bed normally, I'm not a
Exactly. Yeah.
mouth open
Yep.
sleeper, but in that awkward position. But it's super interesting learning how all these things are connected. Um, and it can feel super overwhelming, like that there is so much out of our control. um, I know somebody super close to me that she was in the NICU for several weeks when she was born. And then her first 2 years of life, she was on and off antibiotics constantly. And she's dealt with a lot of health issues as an adult. And it's like, okay, you may not been able to control the hand that you were dealt, but there are things that you can do now to try to build up your immune system and your gut health. And it can be, instead of seeing things as discouraging, like what can be encouraging? What are the things that we can do to really set ourselves up and our family up for this? And we're entering, I guess, like at least where I'm in, like I was saying earlier, it's cold where I live, and the viruses have been crazy this year. The flu
Yep.
season and RSV and just every single thing out there. Um, Before we wrap up, I'd love to just kind of talk about probiotics and prebiotics, their role, and how seed is different than a lot of the other ones on the market, and how that could maybe potentially boost our immune systems.
Absolutely. So, just to go back to like definitions, just because these words are used in such promiscuous ways today, particularly in the U.S., because probiotic and prebiotic is not a term that's regulated in the U.S., but it is in the EU and other places like Japan. So, probiotic scientific definition, or the nerd version, is it is a microorganism, a live microorganism that, when administered in an adequate dose, confers a health benefit to the host. And just to like unpack that, the live is obviously being able to demonstrate the viability and survivability of a microbe. The adequate dose means that you understand the amount that is going into the body in that like viable state, and that the dose was arrived at through studying it clinically, which means in human clinical research. And confers a health benefit means that it was again evaluated biomarkers or benefits or outcomes were evaluated in a clinical setting to confer a benefit to the host, which in this case is us or your children. Prebiotics work in a couple of different ways. The way that most people know prebiotics is the very general, like easy to understand definition, which is just food for good bacteria to grow, which is why like eating fiber can be so meaningful and important, or like eating highly prebiotic foods, because you're essentially just creating a good nutrient source for the good microbes to proliferate, and hopefully take up enough space and dominate that ecology such that it does not become a good place for the bad guys to live and to thrive, which you experience kind of with a parasite as an example. The difference, and when you look at probiotics, I think, one of the things that you learn from the definition I just gave is that you really need to look for, and again, this is really hard to talk about because it puts a tremendous burden on the consumer or the human who's trying to make a good choice for themselves or their family. And it asks a lot, which is you need to know which strains you need and for what benefit. And what happens in the US especially is that you just see these crazy names, which nobody can pronounce. Mm-hmm. You have no idea if the right amount is in there. You don't even know if it's a strain. It might just be the species, which is the equivalent of having a dog and not knowing if it was a lab. And you have no idea if it's even getting to the right place, and whether or not what it's doing, and whether or not the company or the provider of the strain even did any clinical research to even say what is on the bottle, because it's the Wild West right now in this field. When you go into other categories like kombucha or foods like probiotic chocolate, probiotic tortilla chips, my personal favorite, which is probiotic pillowcases, which you can find on Amazon today, that is where it starts to get even shakier, because what that means is that they've just like added probiotics. Now, kombucha and fermented foods like kimchi, kombucha, those are interesting because they are fermented. They're using hundreds, sometimes strains, sometimes a couple for different kombuchas. For kimchi, you can find up to 400 strains sometimes of different microbes. There's and yogurt, for example, which is using specific like lactobacilli, usually for like, for culturing and fermentation. There are absolutely, I believe, benefits, particularly when if you're finding a kombucha or a yogurt or any of these foods that is incredibly low in sugar, has no added sugar. I absolutely believe, and there's a long history from different cultures, Bulgaria being probably like where the birth of like this whole field kind of like probably started, where there's benefits. Do they meet the scientific definition of being a probiotic? Not necessarily, but for example, in kombucha, there's polyphenol, there's phenols because of the tea. So that unto itself probably has a positive benefit. That's not a probiotic, but it probably has some benefit, depending on which kombucha, what it is, does it have sugar, you can't kind of generalize. Kimchi is incredibly fibrous and dense. And the byproducts of lactic acid fermentation can be very beneficial for your health. So the problem is that not all kimchis and kombuchas are created equal. There's no guidance as to what was used. Most of them are not clinically studied, and it's very hard to know whether or not they would be helpful. If you're using a pretty clean one, you like them, most of them are delicious. And you have, like, for example, a very clean yogurt, I do encourage like the consumption of them, but when it comes to like supplementation of specific microbes that have been studied to do very specific things, for example, if I had a child with intermittent constipation, the study that we did, for example, that just was published a couple months ago for our pediatric product, PDS-08, that's the first symbiotic to be studied to be able to very specifically say that you can increase weekly bowel movements in children. It has 5 grams of prebiotic fiber per serving, which we know for children is very hard to get them to meet kind of the daily fiber requirements, just because it's hard to get kids to eat that much vegetables and fruits in a given day, and beans and legumes, etc., in a given day. And so I think you have to, like, for another example is in our adult product DS-01, which has 24 different strains. We have strains that are very specifically studied to trigger and promote motility. So like how stool moves through your body, like just as one example. From an immune health perspective, and this is true for both products, you have strains that trigger, or not trigger, but help maintain the integrity of the gut barrier, the tight junctions of the gut barrier. So they reinforce and promote gut barrier integrity. So like what we were talking about earlier, the integrity of these barriers is really, really important to our health, because you don't want anything, if you've heard of leaky gut, what we don't want is permeability. We don't want, and that's what happens with kids and allergies. It's what happens with other conditions where substances or microbes are moving through those barriers and then triggering your body to think that they need to mount an immune response. And that's that kind of vicious cycle of inflammation that we talked about earlier. And so I think that you choose, like for us, like in DSO1, like that is a very specific and important and a mechanistic way that we know these specific strains promote immune health, as just one example. PDSO8, as I said, I kind of gave other examples. And so that to me is like when you're looking for a probiotic, is what are the strains? You know, both of our products are symbiotics. So you're getting probiotics that have been clinically scientifically studied. And then of course we include prebiotics, and we're looking at how the combination of those in a single product, studying it in, you know, clinical trials to look at even additional endpoints beyond just what the strains were studied for. And then of course, when it comes to testing, I think we test, like, I don't know how long the list of tests is, like, you know, this long. We're in addition to that, we spend a lot of time thinking about what we call delivery kinetics, which means how do you know that you're delivering live and viable microbes to where they need to go in the body? So for example, in DSO1 for our adult product, we have a patent on our capsule and capsule system, which puts our probiotic capsule inside of our prebiotic capsule. And then we test it in a simulation of the human gut called a Shine system to be able to demonstrate that we have 100% deliverability into the gut. Which is really important because microbes are really sensitive. So you put them through digestion and most of them are going to die off.
Right. And into the colon, right? Like that was
Yes.
what I was reading when
Exactly.
with seed, that's different, is because a lot of just the not regulation of probiotics on the market is these things are getting destroyed in the gut and none of it's
Yes.
usable. Whereas like
Exactly.
seed, it's actually getting carried through to the colon and
Yes.
delivering what needs to be
Utilized.
delivered.
Exactly.
Mhm. Yeah, that's so interesting to me. Yeah, I was going to ask about the foods. And so I'm really glad that you touched on that, because all of
Yes.
that's the marketing again is, you know.
Yes, absolutely. And one of the other interesting things for anyone who's listening that is also on a low FODMAP diet is that the prebiotics in our adult product are non-fermenting, which means that for people on low FODMAP diets, they're tolerable because they're not fermenting and creating that kind of discomfort. So that's another kind of benefit that I think a lot of people talk about when they think about our product. And of course the strains and the formulation itself is fascinating, you know, because it goes way beyond, you know, just in the gut benefits, because we include strains that were studied for cardiovascular health that work on that gut liver axis. We included strains that studied for gut skin, so dampening the inflammatory response that has you know, correlated with, like, you know, atopic dermatitis, for example, and eczema. And we're the first probiotic to demonstrate the endogenous or like production of folate in the gut, as well as you know, B12, which is really interesting. And a lot of people don't know microbes are responsible for why you can produce those vitamins, because you couldn't produce them. Your human body cannot produce those.
Yeah, I didn't know that either. I feel like I could talk to you forever about a million things. So I know we have to wrap up. One last question before we wrap up. You guys this last year launched your pediatric probiotic. And so we were talking about, or symbiotic. So we were talking about, you know, setting our kids up for health. Is that something that you recommend that parents can give their kids every single day?
I mean, you know, as I said, like, and this is where you'll see me be sometimes the worst salesperson and sometimes the best. I truly believe one of the most impactful things we can do for children is set them up from a nutritional perspective. Like, you could take anything. There are very few things that you could do to make up for the deficiency around nutrition and diet. In addition to those things though, and particularly, and look, kids are really picky and it is hard to get them to eat a lot of the things that we like want them to be eating. Knowing that 1 in 3 children in this country have intermittent or functional constipation, my answer is resoundingly yes, and it's why we created it. But I also wouldn't want someone to hear that and say that, like, and particularly being mindful of like economics, being mindful of access, being mindful of a number of things. I really believe that nutrition is, and some of the other things we discussed are really important. Complementing that, as I said, both as a fiber supplementation from a fiber perspective, and knowing how many children in this country have a tremendously difficult time going to the bathroom, whether that is from anxiety around pooping, which a lot of kids have, which again, unvirtuous cycle with like having a constipation, because then they get scared to go and it hurts. And there's a whole spectrum of reasons why children have trouble pooping. But when you have 1 in 3 children in this country like having a challenge going to the bathroom, yes, my answer is I do believe that. I think healthy digestion is one of the most critical aspects of health, and a really good marker for and reflection of what's going on inside.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much for coming on. Is there a place where people can just learn more about gut health or microbiome that you
Sure.
recommend?
Seed.com is where you can find us, and then at Seed on Instagram. We put out all kinds of awesome nerdy knowledge all the time.
Awesome. Thank you again so much for coming on and engaging in this conversation with me and all of your wisdom and knowledge. Again, it's something where I feel like I have a billion more questions that I could ask, but I will just go read some articles on seed and learn more for myself. So thank you again so much for your time and energy.
Well, yes, thank you.